The wild world of ancient Rome. To the legions of readers who have ever wondered what it would be like to navigate a Roman street clogged with donkey carts and the occasional rogue chariot, only to arrive at a public bath whose hygiene standards would make a modern-day health inspector faint, this book is for you. To those who've dreamt of witnessing a gladiatorial contest, where the weaponry is as questionable as the refereeing, and the referee is probably also a gladiator, and whose idea of a good time involves questionable political intrigue and enough backstabbing to stock a knife factory. Your curiosity has found its match. This is dedicated to all who appreciate the exquisite blend of chaos and order that was ancient Rome. A society where emperors could be as mad as a hornet, and sometimes literally were, where senators engaged in political shenanigans that would make a reality TV producer weep with joy, and where a simple trip to the market could involve a near-death experience courtesy of a collapsing building, a stampede of livestock, or a particularly ill-tempered citizen with an axe to grind, quite literally sometimes. To all of you, this book offers a comedic tribute to the magnificent, the ridiculous, the utterly baffling, and yes, even the slightly smelly world of ancient Rome. May its pages fill you with laughter, and perhaps a newfound appreciation for the bizarre ingenuity and surprisingly relatable struggles of those who lived over 2,000 years ago. After all, who can resist a historical account peppered with enough side-splitting anecdotes to make even Caesar himself crack a smile, assuming he wasn't too busy plotting his next political maneuver? So, buckle your togas, grab a beaker of wine, preferably not watered down, and prepare for a journey through time that's equal parts history lesson and uproarious comedy show. Because even in the hallowed halls of the past, life was, let's be honest, a little bit absurd. And that's exactly why it's so endlessly fascinating. Chapter 1. A Day in the Life and Death of a Roman. The air hung thick and heavy, a miasma of sweat, dust, and something vaguely resembling roasted goat. This wasn't the fragrant breeze of a Tuscan vineyard. This was Rome, circa 117 AD, and rush hour was in full swing, or rather, a perpetual, chaotic standstill. Forget your meticulously planned commutes and GPS-guided routes. Roman navigation was an exercise in pure, unadulterated survival. Imagine a city teeming with life, but life that hasn't quite figured out the concept of personal space or orderly movement. My fictional Roman friend, let's call him Lucius, because it sounds appropriately Roman and vaguely unfortunate, was attempting to reach the forum. He'd overslept, naturally. The rooster hadn't crowed with the usual punctuality, possibly because it was busy dodging a runaway chariot. Lucius, clutching a half-eaten bread roll, probably slightly stale, given Roman baking technology, weaved through the throng. The streets, or rather pathways, were a maze of unpaved, uneven surfaces, pitted with potholes that would swallow a sandal hole. Imagine cobblestones, but without the benefit of, well, cobblestones being properly laid. His journey began with a near-miss collision with a donkey cart laden with amphorae of questionable wine. The driver, a burly fellow with a surprisingly cheerful disposition considering the precarious balance of his cargo, yelled something in Latin that roughly translated to, "Watch where you're going, you oversized olive." Lucius, muttering apologies, squeezed past, narrowly avoiding a spill that would have ruined both his tunic and his morning. The human traffic was even more challenging. Lucius, a reasonably average-height Roman, found himself constantly jostled by people of all sizes and social standings. Wealthy patricians in their togas, their faces etched with the importance of whatever meeting they were late for, barely registered his presence. Merchants hawked their wares, their voices a cacophony of competing pitches. Children playing a surprisingly violent game of capture the stray dog darted between legs. Servants, laden with baskets overflowing with produce, and likely a few less than fresh scraps, navigated the chaos with the practiced grace of a seasoned slalom skier. Then there were the smells. Oh, the smells. A potent blend of unwashed bodies, animal dung, rotting vegetables, and the ever-present aroma of urine. The Romans, let's be honest, weren't exactly renowned for their sanitation practices. Waste disposal was a remarkably laissez-faire affair. Tossing your refuse into the street wasn't just acceptable, it was the norm. Lucius carefully picked his way around a particularly pungent pile, mentally calculating the odds of stepping in it versus the likelihood of being trampled by a passing legionary. And the legionaries, these were the undisputed kings, or should we say emperors, of the Roman road. Marching in disciplined formation, they paid little attention to the hapless civilians attempting to navigate around them. Lucius, ever the optimist, found himself repeatedly forced into the uncomfortable proximity of a particularly sweaty centurion. He silently prayed that the soldiers' recent lunch hadn't involved too much garlic. Think of modern rush hour, but replace cars with donkey carts, buses with overflowing litter, and traffic lights with the sheer indifference of a Roman legion. The sense of claustrophobia was intense. The air was thick, the sounds deafening, and the smells... Well, let's just say that Lucius was starting to appreciate the virtues of a well-ventilated house. Adding to the chaos were the stray animals, dogs, cats, and the occasional escaped pig, weaving their way through the throngs. They were as much a part of the Roman streetscape as the people. The occasional screech of a hawk overhead added to the symphony of urban noise. It was a far cry from the organized, efficient traffic systems we take for granted today. Yet, amidst this chaos, there was a peculiar energy, a vibrant pulse that throbbed at the heart of Roman life. Lucius finally arrived at the Forum, more than a little ruffled, but surprisingly intact. He'd managed to avoid serious injury, only losing a small portion of his bread roll to a stray dog with excellent scavenging skills. It was a victory, a small triumph in the daily battle against Roman congestion. As he joined the throngs of people going about their business, he reflected on the unique experience of a Roman commute, a daily adventure that tested the limits of patience, agility, and olfactory resilience. He wouldn't trade it for anything. Well, maybe for a slightly less chaotic road, and perhaps some decent-smelling streets. But that was a wish for another day. For now, the Forum awaited, and with it, the possibility of a slightly less eventful afternoon, or perhaps another near-death experience involving a runaway chariot. Rome, after all, was never dull. The lack of designated walkways, pedestrian crossings, or even a basic understanding of traffic management led to a continuous ballet of near misses and frustrated shouts. The streets were so narrow in many places that two carts could barely pass side by side. Imagine trying to navigate a crowded marketplace with a cart full of pottery, a task that would inevitably result in cracked pots, shattered nerves, and more than a few colorful curses from both the driver and those unfortunate enough to be within the blast radius of their frustration. The sheer volume of people added another layer of complexity to the Roman traffic system. With little in the way of personal space or road etiquette, getting from point A to point B often involved a degree of physical wrestling. Lucius often found himself wedged between a rotund merchant and a stoic legionary, an experience akin to being sandwiched between two immovable objects. The resulting pressure often led to the involuntary release of various bodily fluids, a not-so-subtle reminder of the lack of sanitation in the city. And let's not forget the animals. Donkeys, laden with goods, were a common sight, their drivers bellowing orders and curses as they navigated the crowded thoroughfares. Stray dogs scavenged for scraps, weaving in and out of traffic with an unnerving agility. The occasional goat, perhaps having escaped its pen, might add a touch of unexpected chaos to an already stressful situation. Lucius developed a sixth sense for predicting the movements of these four-legged obstacles, a skill essential for survival on the Roman streets. The lack of effective waste disposal was another factor contributing to the city's chaotic streets. Rubbish was simply dumped wherever convenient, often directly onto the street. This created a minefield of unpleasant surprises for the unwary pedestrian, adding a strong olfactory component to the already challenging conditions. Lucius, adept at avoiding the larger piles, had nonetheless developed a keen sense for identifying potential hazards and avoiding them with practiced ease. Comparing this to modern-day traffic congestion offers a fascinating perspective. While we might complain about rush hour traffic jams, road rage, and the occasional fender bender, we have traffic lights, road markings, and an, occasionally, functioning system of traffic control. The Romans, on the other hand, relied on a combination of luck, agility, and a healthy dose of shouting. It was a system that may have been chaotic, but it was also surprisingly effective. Even in the midst of the pandemonium, people somehow managed to get to their destinations, proving the resilience and adaptability of human beings under even the most challenging circumstances. The experience of navigating Roman traffic was far from pleasant. It was noisy, smelly, and frequently dangerous, yet it was also a deeply visceral experience, a testament to the vibrant energy of a city bursting with life. Lucius's daily commute, though far from idyllic, formed an integral part of the rhythm of his life in ancient Rome, a daily reminder of the chaotic, unpredictable, yet undeniably captivating nature of the city. And he, like countless others, somehow managed to navigate it every day, proving once again that Romans were truly masters of their own peculiar form of organized chaos. Having survived the Roman rush hour equivalent of a gladiatorial contest in the streets, Lucius finally reached his destination, the public baths. He envisioned a tranquil oasis of cleanliness and relaxation, a Roman equivalent of a modern spa. The reality, however, was somewhat less idyllic. The entrance was a cacophony of splashing water, grunts, and the unmistakable aroma of unwashed bodies, mingling with something vaguely floral, probably an attempt at masking the pervasive odor of sweat and something akin to week-old fish. Lucius paid his modest fee, a few denarii, less than the cost of a decent amphora of wine, and stepped inside. The first room was the frigidarium, intended to be a cool plunge pool. In theory. In practice, it was more of a lukewarm tepidarium that reeked of chlorine, though the source of that chlorine was decidedly less sophisticated than modern-day chemical treatment. The water was murky, to say the least, and littered with floating debris, not the serene, sparkling blue of a modern spa, but something more akin to a swamp. Lucius observed a few older men attempting a game of water polo with a suspiciously misshapen piece of what looked like driftwood. He decided to skip the refreshing dip. Next came the tepidarium, a warm room meant for gradual acclimatization before braving the heat of the caldarium. It was crowded, a steamy, sweaty scrum of bodies. Men of all ages and social strata occupied every inch of space, chatting, grooming, and generally behaving as if personal space were a mythical creature. The air hung heavy with humidity, and the scent of various unguents and oils, an attempt, albeit a somewhat feeble one, to combat the underlying aroma of unwashed humanity. Lucius managed to find a spot on a bench near a mosaic depicting a rather unfortunate-looking satyr and attempted to relax. Relaxation, however, was difficult. A burly legionary, seemingly oblivious to the concept of personal space, settled down beside him, immediately initiating a conversation about the merits of various gladiatorial styles. Lucius, keen to avoid a detailed discussion of throat-slitting techniques, politely excused himself and moved on. The caldarium, the hottest room, was an even more intense sensory experience. The air was thick with steam, so hot it felt like being enveloped in a humid blanket. Lucius, his eyes watering, attempted to find a spot where he could avoid getting scalded. The floor was slippery, and the temperature was more than enough to encourage a hasty exit. People were loudly complaining to the attendants about how this was meant to be the hottest room. Lucius decided against taking a longer bath here. The most interesting, though not necessarily pleasant aspect of the Roman bathhouse was the social aspect. The baths weren't just about hygiene, or what passed for hygiene in ancient Rome. They were a major social hub, a place where people of different social classes could, theoretically, mingle. In reality, there was a clear social hierarchy. The wealthier patrons had their own private areas and often paid for additional services, such as massages and elaborate beauty treatments. Lucius, being a commoner, wasn't privy to these luxuries, but he observed their leisurely enjoyment from afar. The lack of modern hygiene practices was striking. There were no individual shower stalls, no soap dispensers, and certainly no disposable towels. Patrons shared communal oil and scrapers, the thought of which sent a shiver down Lucius's spine. He observed a few men diligently scraping themselves with what appeared to be a metal implement, a sight that simultaneously fascinated and horrified him. He opted for a more understated approach, simply wiping himself down with a cloth that had certainly seen better days. The social interactions were equally intriguing. Discussions ranged from politics and philosophy to gossip and rumors, all conducted amidst a backdrop of splashing water, shouts, and the occasional eruption of laughter. Lucius even overheard a heated debate about the relative merits of different types of wine, a topic that could ignite a fierce conversation in any time period. The lack of privacy was complete. Men of all shapes and sizes were in various stages of undress, their bodies glistening with oil or sweat. Lucius, used to the relative modesty of his own household, found the openness quite shocking. It wasn't the quiet, contemplative experience of a modern spa. It was more akin to a boisterous, communal locker room, though perhaps one with fewer rules and significantly less hygiene. Despite the lack of cleanliness, the baths served a vital social function. They were a place for relaxation, socializing, and the pursuit of a certain level of hygiene. Lucius, despite the initial shock, found himself enjoying the experience. The camaraderie, the chance to engage in conversation with fellow Romans, and the relative escape from the clamor of the city streets made it a welcome break in his daily routine. It wasn't a spa day in the modern sense, but it was a social event, an integral part of Roman life, with its own unique charm, or perhaps a unique aroma. Emerging from the baths, Lucius felt somewhat cleaner, though the lingering smells of the various concoctions used within them was noticeable. His clothes were still damp, and the lingering aroma of other people was not entirely pleasing. He reflected on the bizarre mix of societal interactions and lack of hygiene. It was an experience far removed from the tranquil, antiseptic atmosphere of a modern spa, yet it served a similar purpose: to provide a temporary escape from the pressures of daily life, albeit with a distinct Roman twist. The comparison to modern spas highlighted the remarkable differences between Roman and modern attitudes towards hygiene, socialization, and relaxation. We value privacy, individual cleanliness, and a sense of tranquility. The Romans, on the other hand, seemed to embrace communal interaction, a more relaxed attitude towards personal hygiene, and a boisterous social environment. Yet both sought the same fundamental goal: respite and rejuvenation, albeit achieved through vastly different methods. Lucius, still smelling faintly of sulfur and unwashed bodies, felt a sense of accomplishment. He'd survived another Roman bathhouse experience, a small but significant victory in the ongoing battle for survival in the chaotic heart of the empire. And that, he thought, was something worth celebrating, perhaps with a glass of, hopefully, fresh wine. Leaving the public baths, still faintly smelling of 1,000 shared sweat glands and something vaguely floral, an unsuccessful attempt at perfume, no doubt, Lucius felt the familiar pang of hunger. His stomach rumbled, a protest against its current state of near emptiness. Forget the tranquility of a modern spa. Acquiring food in ancient Rome was a culinary adventure, a gamble between a delicious feast and a bout of food poisoning that would rival the worst gladiatorial wounds. His first stop was the bustling marketplace, a cacophony of sights, sounds, and smells. Vendors hawked their wares with the same aggressive enthusiasm as modern-day telemarketers. Only their pitch involved less technology and more aggressive hand gestures. The air vibrated with the energy of 1,000 transactions, a vibrant tapestry of culinary possibilities and potential digestive disasters. Lucius navigated the crowded stalls, his eyes scanning the available provisions. Mountains of olives, their briny scent overpowering everything else, competed for attention with baskets of pungent garlic, stacks of fragrant herbs, and mounds of glistening, suspiciously colored cheese. He paused before a stall overflowing with fish, their freshness or lack thereof a subject of intense debate. Some looked remarkably lively, wriggling slightly in their baskets, a testament to Roman methods of food preservation, or perhaps a cruel joke of nature. Others, however, wore a less cheerful expression, their glassy eyes staring blankly ahead, suggesting an expiration date that had passed several days ago. Lucius, wary of accidentally purchasing a seafood platter capable of launching 1,000 plagues, opted for a more conservative approach. He purchased a loaf of bread, its crust dark and crackly, promising a satisfying crunch. The baker, a stout man with flour dusting his apron and a surprisingly cheerful disposition, assured Lucius of the bread's freshness, though given his generous use of the word fresh, Lucius remained cautiously optimistic. Next came the vegetables. A colorful array of produce sat under the watchful gaze of a vendor with the personality of a disgruntled gargoyle. Lucius picked out a few plump tomatoes, their redness hinting at sweetness, along with some leeks and onions vegetables that might mask the questionable freshness of his potential fish purchase. His next stop was a stall selling various types of pulses. Lentils, chickpeas, and beans filled large woven baskets, their earthy aroma a welcoming contrast to the fishy odor lingering from the previous stall. Lucius chose a small portion of lentils, hoping to add some protein and fiber to his meal. They were relatively cheap, and, unlike the fish, unlikely to send him to the afterlife prematurely. Finally, he made his way to the meat section, an area requiring a degree of both bravery and discretion. The meat was displayed with a certain nonchalant disregard for hygiene, its freshness being a subject open to interpretation. Lucius steered clear of the more questionable cuts, those with an alarming hue or a particularly pungent aroma, opting instead for a modest portion of chicken, hoping it was indeed chicken and not something else masquerading as such. With his ingredients acquired, Lucius headed home, his arms laden with a surprisingly heavy bag of provisions. Reaching his humble dwelling, he set about preparing his meal. The kitchen wasn't exactly state-of-the-art. It was a simple room with a hearth and basic cooking equipment. The lack of modern conveniences made cooking an involved process, requiring patience, skill, and a considerable degree of improvisational talent. The bread, thankfully, lived up to its crusty promise. The lentils, after a vigorous boil, were pleasantly soft, though somewhat lacking in seasoning. The chicken, after careful inspection and a thorough cooking, turned out to be edible, though its taste was less than exceptional. The tomatoes, leeks, and onions, however, elevated the meal to surprising heights. Their simple flavors, combined with a sprinkling of salt and a dash of herbs, created a satisfying and unexpectedly delicious dish. It wasn't a gourmet feast worthy of an emperor's table, but it was sufficient. Lucius sat down to his meal, grateful for its simple sustenance. He ate slowly, savoring the flavors and the satisfaction of a meal earned through the careful navigation of the Roman marketplace. But the culinary adventures of ancient Rome didn't stop at the daily meals of the commoners. For the wealthy, dining was an elaborate spectacle, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and power. Banquets were lavish affairs filled with extravagant displays of food, drink, and entertainment. The tables groaned under the weight of exotic delicacies, roasted peacocks, stuffed dormice, and pastries filled with exotic fruits, creating a gastronomic spectacle that would make even the most discerning modern chef envious. Imagine, if you will, a table laden with roasted boar, its skin glistening with honey and spices. Nearby, a platter holds exotic birds carefully arranged to impress. Then, there are the elaborate pastries, towering structures of sugar and spice decorated with intricate designs. Dishes were served with a sense of drama, each course a carefully choreographed performance. The food was as much a visual spectacle as it was a culinary experience. Wine naturally flowed freely. The Romans, unlike us with our pretentious wine snobs, embraced the simpler pleasures of wine, large quantities of it, without the airs of sophisticated pairings. Water was viewed with suspicion, and wine, considered more hygienic, was the drink of choice even for breakfast. However, the extravagant feasts of the rich also came with their own unique set of challenges. Food poisoning was a constant threat, and the extravagant preparations often involved exotic ingredients of dubious origin. A poorly prepared dish could easily ruin a banquet, transforming an evening of celebration into a night of stomach-churning misery. The risk of spoiled food was ever present, a constant reminder that even in the heart of an empire, the simplest of things could turn deadly. The Roman culinary landscape, from the humble lentils of Lucius's dinner to the peacock-laden feasts of the elite, reflects a fascinating blend of ingenuity, resourcefulness, and a healthy dose of culinary chaos. The simple meals of the commoners, though modest in comparison to their wealthier counterparts, spoke to their resilience and ability to make the most of what little they had, while the lavish banquets of the rich showcased the extravagant excess of Roman life. It was a world of contrasts, a culinary landscape as vibrant and unpredictable as the empire itself, and if you survived it, you could safely say that you had truly lived. Having filled his belly with a surprisingly satisfying meal, Lucius decided to venture out again, not for sustenance this time, but for entertainment. Ancient Rome wasn't just about politics, power struggles, and questionable hygiene in public baths. It was also a spectacle-driven society, a place where the line between life and death was often blurred, especially in the name of entertainment. Forget your Netflix binges. The Romans had something far more visceral. The Colosseum loomed in the distance, a concrete behemoth that promised an afternoon of thrills, spills, and quite possibly a generous helping of gore. The air buzzed with anticipation, a palpable energy that crackled like static electricity before a thunderstorm. The streets overflowed with a tide of humanity, a swirling vortex of togas, sandals, and the occasional stray dog attempting to navigate the chaos. The aroma of roasted nuts, cheap wine, and sweat hung heavy in the air, a potent cocktail of sensations that only ancient Rome could conjure. Lucius secured a spot in the stands, a vantage point offering a reasonably good view of the arena floor. The Colosseum itself was a marvel of engineering, a testament to Roman ingenuity and a symbol of their rather bloodthirsty passion for entertainment. He imagined the builders, probably cursing their aching backs and questionable pay, little realizing that their creation would become synonymous with the spectacular cruelty and surprisingly sophisticated entertainment of the Roman world. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a wave of sound that crashed over him, washing away any lingering thoughts of his lentil-based lunch. The arena below was a scene of controlled chaos, a stage set for the brutal ballet of gladiatorial combat. These weren't just fighters, they were celebrities, rock stars of their time, each with their own fan base, their own tragic backstories, and their own surprisingly well-defined brand identities. A hush fell over the crowd as the announcer, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the massive amphitheater, introduced the first gladiatorial pair. The names were announced with the fanfare usually reserved for triumphant generals returning from successful conquests. One was a Threx, easily identifiable by his distinctive curved scimitar and small shield, while the other was a Murmillo, heavily armored with a large rectangular shield and a formidable gladius. Each fighter was a study in controlled aggression, their bodies taut, their eyes fixed on their opponent with the single-minded intensity of a predator stalking its prey. They paraded before the Emperor's box, acknowledging the crowd's frenzied cheers and the Emperor's thumbs up, a gesture of life or death. The combat began with a flurry of motion, a dizzying dance of steel and sweat. The Thrax, smaller and faster, darted around his opponent, his scimitar flashing like a lethal hummingbird. The Murmillo, slower but far more heavily armored, relied on brute force and his larger shield, deflecting the Thrax's attacks while trying to land powerful blows. The crowd roared its approval, the air thick with the smell of blood and anticipation. The gladiators, despite the obvious danger, showed impressive athleticism and technical skill. Their movements were a blend of choreographed precision and improvised savagery, a high-stakes combination of skill and deadly chance. The fight was a brutal spectacle, a clash of skill, strength, and sheer survival instinct. The crowd was captivated, a mass of heaving bodies, their collective breath held in suspense. The battle raged on, punctuated by gasps and roars as the gladiators exchanged blows, the clang of metal echoing through the arena. Blood flowed, wounds were inflicted, and the fight had a certain undeniable choreography, despite its violent, unpredictable nature. It wasn't merely combat that drove the spectacle. The sheer scale of the Colosseum's events was significant. The games also featured mock naval battles, staged in the flooded arena. Imagine the logistical nightmare, transporting enough water to fill the massive arena, constructing temporary ships, and recruiting actors who could swim, or at least pretend to. The sheer audacity of such displays is astounding, a feat of engineering, organization, and possibly a touch of Roman madness. But the Roman obsession with spectacle extended far beyond the gladiatorial arena. Chariot races were another hugely popular form of entertainment, a high-octane blend of speed, skill, and the inevitable carnage that came with racing around a track at breakneck speed in a vehicle pulled by 4 horses. Think Formula One, but with less safety regulations and far more potential for gruesome accidents. The charioteers were rock stars in their own right, and their teams, each with their own distinctive colors and zealous fans, sparked intense rivalries and mass celebrations. Even public executions were a spectacle, transforming the brutal act of state-sponsored violence into a carefully choreographed performance. These weren't hushed affairs. They were massive public events, designed to remind everyone of the power of the emperor and to inspire or perhaps instill fear in the common people. The sheer scale of Roman entertainment, its blend of violence and artistry, its remarkable production values, is what made it so compelling. It wasn't just about the brutality. It was about the theatrical quality of the events, the spectacle, the sheer drama of it all. These spectacles offered a potent mix of excitement, fear, and a shared sense of community that resonated with the people of Rome. One could argue that the Roman obsession with spectacle mirrors our own modern obsession with reality TV and extreme sports. The appeal of watching other people engage in dangerous activities, pushing their physical and mental limits, seems to be a timeless human trait. Whether it's gladiators battling to the death or contestants battling on a reality show for a prize, the underlying desire to witness spectacle, the thrill of suspense, and the excitement of unpredictable outcomes continues to hold a powerful allure. Lucius, after the gladiatorial spectacle, left the Colosseum, his ears ringing, his senses overwhelmed. The afternoon had been a potent cocktail of violence, drama, and sheer spectacle, leaving him with a strange mixture of exhilaration and weariness. It was a far cry from his simple lentil lunch, but it was, undeniably, an experience quintessentially Roman. It was a reminder that even in a world rife with corruption, oppression, and questionable sanitation, the Romans knew how to put on a good show, even if it occasionally involved a generous amount of bloodshed. As he walked home, the echoes of the crowd's roar, the clang of steel, and the scent of blood and sweat still lingered in the air, a tangible reminder of a day well spent, and perhaps somewhat violently entertained. He wondered what tomorrow's spectacle would be. Perhaps a public execution? A chariot race? He certainly wouldn't want to miss it. The crowds had thinned considerably by the time Lucius emerged from the Colosseum's shadow, the roar of the arena replaced by the quieter, more insidious sounds of the Roman night. Gone was the organized chaos of the day. The city now hummed with a different kind of energy, a nocturnal pulse less vibrant yet arguably more intriguing. The air, thick with the day's sweat and the lingering scent of blood, had cooled slightly, carrying with it the unfamiliar smells of wood smoke and something vaguely unpleasant, perhaps the refuse from a nearby tavern. Lucius, accustomed to the bustling daytime streets, found himself slightly disoriented in the gloom. Forget the reassuring glow of streetlights. The only illumination came from flickering oil lamps hanging precariously from buildings, casting dancing shadows that stretched and warped familiar streets into something mysterious and slightly menacing. The light was insufficient for the task, leaving much of the city shrouded in a twilight that both intrigued and slightly terrified. It felt like stepping into a world where anything could be lurking just beyond the reach of the limited illumination. Compared to a modern city at night, where even the darkest corners are illuminated by security cameras and the distant glow of streetlights, Rome felt dangerously intimate. Navigating the narrow, unpaved streets was a challenge in itself. Loose stones, discarded refuse, and the occasional sleeping dog made for a treacherous path. Imagine walking home late at night in modern times, but instead of tripping over a crack in the pavement, you risk stumbling into a pile of rotting vegetables, or a less than pleasant surprise left behind by a stray animal. It wasn't merely inconvenient, it was a sensory overload. Every step required careful consideration, a heightened awareness of one's surroundings that a modern citizen only experiences during a horror movie. The absence of any organized sanitation system in ancient Rome added to the night's sensory assault. Unlike modern cities with their well-defined waste management systems, rubbish lay scattered everywhere, a festering mix of food scraps, animal waste, and other unsavory debris. The smell alone was enough to induce a headache, a potent reminder of the city's unsanitary conditions. Picture this: your nightly walk home, only instead of fresh air, you're inhaling a cocktail of rotting food, animal droppings, and discarded refuse, a stark contrast to the sanitized environments we expect today. But the lack of proper lighting and sanitation was only part of the picture. The Roman night was also a dangerous place, far removed from the relative safety of a modern city, even in its most crime-ridden corners. Without the aid of modern security technologies, criminals operated with relative impunity. Robbery, assault, and even murder were not uncommon occurrences after dark. The lack of consistent lighting in these narrow streets only exacerbated the darkness, providing a perfect cover for illicit activities. One had to be constantly vigilant, aware of every shadow, every sound, every person moving at the edge of visibility. It was a far cry from our modern reliance on CCTV cameras, motion sensor lights, and rapid police response times. Survival in ancient Rome at night relied heavily on luck, awareness, and the ability to move quietly and quickly. As Lucius continued his journey, he noticed a group of shady characters huddled near the entrance of a dimly lit tavern. Their conversation was low and menacing, their shadows blending seamlessly with the darkness. He instinctively quickened his pace, avoiding eye contact, his heart pounding in his chest. In this environment, any hint of defiance or confrontation would have been a recipe for disaster, leaving one at the mercy of the street's harsher inhabitants. It wasn't a rational fear, it was a primal instinct triggered by the city's nocturnal dangers, which the modern world has, for the most part, eliminated. The relative quietude of the Roman night was frequently punctuated by sudden outbursts, the drunken brawl spilling out from a tavern, the desperate cries of a street vendor trying to make a last few sales before nightfall, or the barking of a stray dog startled by some unseen movement. These were not gentle sounds, rather loud interruptions to the overall quietude, reminding Lucius and the reader that the night was far from peaceful. It was alive with its own unique brand of unpredictable chaos, which we today mostly experience vicariously through media. Despite the inherent dangers, the Roman night also possessed a certain charm. The absence of daytime clamor allowed for a different kind of appreciation of the city's architecture. The way the moonlight filtered through the gaps in the buildings, the faint sounds of water trickling from a nearby fountain. It was a glimpse into a quieter, more contemplative side of Roman life, one easily obscured by the constant bustle of the day. It wasn't the manicured peace of a modern suburban night, but rather a raw, visceral tranquility that coexisted with the ever-present threat of danger. Finally, Lucius reached his modest apartment, thankful to have navigated the city's shadowy streets unscathed. He secured his door with a heavy bar, a rudimentary security measure, and glanced out at the night sky, its familiar constellations a welcome contrast to the uncertainty of the streets. The quiet of his small dwelling was a stark contrast to the city's vibrant nocturnal energy, a reminder of the solace found within one's home in contrast to the city's relentless vitality. He could hear the occasional distant drunken shout and the occasional stray canine bark, but he was far from the dangers he had encountered in the streets. Before retiring, Lucius prepared his simple bed, a straw mattress laid upon a wooden frame. He considered the day, which even by Roman standards had been a rather eventful one. The Colosseum, with its barbaric beauty and violent spectacles, and the perilous journey home were etched into his memory. He reflected on the sharp contrast between the organized chaos of the day and the uncertain danger of the night. He considered the lack of modern conveniences and sanitation compared to what he would consider his modern counterpart's life. He knew, however, that while the modern world offered better sanitation and safety, it could not possibly rival the intensity of experiences that a day and night in ancient Rome offered. As sleep finally claimed him, Lucius dreamt not of gladiators or criminals, but of a strangely peaceful Roman night, a night where the stars shone brighter than any oil lamp, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water and the distant chirping of crickets. It was a comforting fantasy, a necessary respite from the harsh realities of his everyday life. It was a dream of a Rome that perhaps never truly existed, a romanticized version of a city that existed far removed from modern comfort and safety. However, it served as a testament to the enduring human need for peace, even in the most chaotic of environments. And as he drifted off to sleep, Lucius wondered what new adventures and dangers awaited him on the morrow. Chapter 2. Politics, Power, and Pretty Awful Plumbing. Let's talk emperors. Specifically, let's talk about the emperors and their personal hygiene habits. Now, I know what you're thinking. Historians are boring. They just talk about dates and battles. But I'm not your average historian. I'm here to tell you about the emperors, those titans of power, those masters of the universe, and the surprisingly smelly realities of their lives. Because even Caesar himself couldn't escape the realities of Roman plumbing, or the lack thereof. Imagine, if you will, the imperial palace. Marble floors, priceless artwork, legions of slaves at your beck and call. Sounds glamorous, right? It was until you considered the realities of daily life. Let's take, for example, Emperor Nero, a man who famously fiddled while Rome burned. He also, according to some less than flattering accounts, possessed a less than regal approach to bathing. While modern historians debate the specifics, the general consensus is that the famed emperor wasn't exactly known for his commitment to regular bathing. Some accounts whisper of a certain aroma that clung to him like a particularly persistent perfume. A perfume, if you can call it that might have been more accurately described as a bouquet of sweat, old wine, and the faint hint of something vaguely equine. And Nero wasn't alone in his less than fresh approach to personal cleanliness. Many emperors, burdened by the weight of their responsibilities and possibly a considerable amount of body odor, prioritized matters of state over matters of soap and water. We have a plethora of anecdotal evidence ranging from gossip whispered by disgruntled courtiers to thinly veiled insults in satirical writings, hinting at the less than hygienic reality faced by the population at large, starting with the emperors themselves. Think of it as a sort of trickle-down unsanitariness. If the emperor wasn't a stickler for personal grooming, chances are that the rest of the imperial court wasn't all that fragrant either. The public baths, of course, were supposed to be the solution. But picture this: a vast, crowded hall filled with sweating bodies, the air thick with the aroma of unwashed flesh, and the ever-present undercurrent of, well, let's just say things that are better left unsaid. It wasn't exactly a spa day. It was more of a communal sauna with an unexpectedly high concentration of robust smells. Add to this the fact that the water wasn't always particularly clean, and you have a recipe for a less than refreshing experience. To imagine a typical day at the baths, picture a crowded, steamy room where the air hums with conversation, laughter, and a pervasive scent that defied easy classification. It was an assault on the senses, an experience that tested the limits of olfactory endurance. Now let's talk about clothing. Remember the story of the emperor's new clothes. It's a great fable, but also a surprisingly accurate reflection of the Roman imperial court. While emperors weren't routinely parading around in their underwear, at least not publicly, their clothing choices could be equally questionable. Imagine the sheer volume of togas an emperor would go through in a single day. We're talking about heavy wool garments, not exactly breathable or quick drying. Add in the fact that sweating profusely in such an environment wouldn't be unusual for an emperor, as well as most Romans, and you can begin to understand the challenges of maintaining personal hygiene. Sweaty togas weren't exactly conducive to freshness, making the need for regular changes a matter of both comfort and a basic sanitation. The problem wasn't just about a lack of clean clothes, it was about the sheer quantity of clothes. Even the simplest of garments would require a significant amount of upkeep. Washing them, if one so desired, would have been a very time-consuming and labor-intensive affair. We're talking about a washing process often done by hand, using lye and river water. Add to this the necessity for maintaining a large wardrobe fit for an emperor's lifestyle, and you might begin to see why regularly changing clothing and maintaining hygiene could prove a real challenge. But the emperors weren't merely struggling with basic hygiene. They were also dealing with the expectations of their positions. They were expected to maintain an image of power, authority, and, well, cleanliness, at least outwardly. This created an interesting paradox. While emperors were only human and susceptible to the same bodily functions as everyone else, they couldn't afford to show it. They had to maintain an image of impeccable composure and dignity, a feat made even more difficult by the realities of Roman sanitation and the sheer volume of their elaborate clothing. They had to maintain the image of an untouchable god among men, even when the reality might have been something considerably less divine. This tension between reality and image is what makes the lives of the Roman emperors so fascinating. They were, after all, just people. They ate, they slept, they sweat, and yes, they probably smelled. And the contrast between their immense power and their surprisingly human flaws is a comedic and unexpectedly informative part of history. The emperors, in all their glorious robes and overflowing baths, were still just as susceptible to the odors and embarrassments that afflict us all. And that, my friends, is something to chuckle about. Beyond the fragrant details, let's also consider the political implications of imperial hygiene, or lack thereof. A slightly less than fresh emperor could significantly impact court life. Imagine the courtiers forced to endure the emperor's, shall we say, potent aroma during hours-long meetings. Their delicate noses, accustomed to the fragrant perfumes of the upper classes, would have been subject to a rather different and considerably less pleasant experience. This could lead to strategic maneuvering and elaborate avoidance tactics within the court, all to avoid catching a whiff of the emperor's unique scent. It adds a whole new layer of intrigue to courtly politics, doesn't it? Furthermore, the emperor's apparent lack of personal hygiene could be interpreted in various ways by the people and other world powers. It could be perceived as a sign of decadence, a lack of self-control, or even a divine punishment, all of which could have political ramifications within the empire itself and in interactions with other kingdoms and empires. Consider the imperial wardrobe itself. We have evidence that emperors wore layers upon layers of fine fabrics, silks, wools, linens, all heavily embroidered and adorned. Think of the sheer weight of all that material, particularly in the Roman heat. The emperor was literally swathed in pounds of heavy clothing, creating a veritable greenhouse effect that could have made a simple stroll through the gardens a sweaty affair. It would likely be nearly impossible to maintain one's freshness under these conditions. Imagine the amount of upkeep needed. It was far from a simple laundry day. Each garment likely required a team of skilled artisans to maintain its condition and appearance. Finally, let's not forget the role of medicine, or the lack of effective medicine, in all of this. Ancient Roman medical practices, while not entirely without merit, often left a lot to be desired. Many cures were based on dubious logic and relied on ingredients that wouldn't exactly pass modern health inspections. In fact, some of the remedies of the time could have only served to worsen the problems caused by a lack of personal hygiene. The situation was far from ideal. So the next time you're faced with the mundane realities of daily life, think about the Roman emperors. Think about the weight of their crowns, the burden of their power, and the surprisingly relatable problems of sweaty clothes and questionable aromas. It adds a touch of unexpected humanity to these larger-than-life figures, transforming the image of a seemingly untouchable ruler into a person who dealt with much of the same mundane issues as the rest of us. And yes, it's a reminder that even the mightiest of rulers had to deal with smelly situations, just like us, and perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. The air in the Roman Senate hung thick with the scent of sweat, stale perfume, and simmering resentment. It wasn't just the heat of the Roman summer. It was the palpable tension that crackled between the senators, a volatile mix of ambition, backstabbing, and the ever-present fear of falling out of favor. Think of it as a high-stakes game of political poker, played with togas instead of chips, and with the potential consequences far exceeding a mere financial loss. This particular day, the Senate was buzzing with anticipation. A crucial vote was looming. A new aqueduct, promised to deliver fresh water to the lower districts, was up for debate. Naturally, it wasn't simply a matter of providing clean water to the populace. Oh no, this was Rome. It was a stage for a gladiatorial contest of political maneuvering, where alliances shifted as quickly as the sands in the Colosseum. Senator Flavius, a man whose vanity was only surpassed by his questionable fashion choices, think a toga made of clashing colors and adorned with far too many gold tassels, strutted into the Senate chamber, his arrogance preceding him like a herald. He was the champion of the aqueduct project, a champion who saw the project not as a civic duty, but as a golden opportunity for personal enrichment. Opposite him sat Senator Valerius, a wizened old fox whose cunning was as legendary as his collection of ancient scrolls. Valerius was the master of subtle manipulation, a man who could weave a web of intrigue with the dexterity of a spider. He saw Flavius's brazen ambition as a chance to exploit the situation and gain more political leverage. He'd seen many an aqueduct project come and go, and he'd learned that the real water flowed in the currents of political power. The debate began, a cacophony of voices that mirrored the turmoil in the Roman streets. Flavius launched into a grandiose speech, his words echoing through the Senate chamber, promising a golden age of clean water and civic pride. He painted a picture of overflowing fountains, sparkling canals, and a populace showering with joy, much like an infomercial promising the cure to all your plumbing woes. Valerius, ever the pragmatist, countered with his usual dry wit, pointing out the exorbitant cost of the aqueduct, the potential for corruption, and the sheer impracticality of getting clean water to certain areas. Some of the city's less favored neighborhoods were built on hillsides that would have presented significant engineering challenges. The other senators, a mix of ambitious young pups and seasoned power brokers, watched the spectacle unfold, their faces inscrutable masks of political calculation. Some were swayed by Flavius's promises, others remained skeptical. The air was thick with whispers, and side deals were brokered with the speed of a chariot race. A hush fell over the Senate as the vote commenced. Each senator, one by one, declared their decision. The tension was almost unbearable, a palpable sense of anticipation that hung in the air like the smell of slightly off wine after a lengthy Senate debate. The votes were counted, tallied, and then announced by the presiding senator, his voice echoing through the chamber. It was a close call, a nail-biter of a vote. But in the end, Flavius's project passed. A triumphant grin spread across his face, but it didn't last long. Valerius, with a sly wink, pointed out a minor clause buried deep within the project's documentation, a seemingly innocuous detail that gave Valerius and his allies complete control over the funding, budget, and construction. Flavius's face was a mixture of shock and betrayal, like someone who had just learned that the free pizza offer only applied to pizza rolls. The irony of the situation was as thick as the toga sweat in the chamber. Flavius, the self-proclaimed hero of the aqueduct, had been utterly outmaneuvered by the ever-so-clever Valerius. The Senate erupted in a wave of murmurs, the undercurrent of political intrigue as thick as the dust on the Roman roads. Alliances shifted, whispers turned to shouts, and the previously silent senators were suddenly involved in heated arguments over who was going to get which contracts. Meanwhile, Valerius was enjoying his wine, smugly looking forward to lining his pockets and further solidifying his position within the Roman power structure. It was, after all, just another day in the Roman Senate, a reality show of political maneuvering with higher stakes than any modern television drama could ever hope to match. The entire scene unfolded much like a modern reality TV show, full of betrayal, alliances, and backstabbing in its pursuit for power, and the drama was just as intense. We could practically hear the voiceovers. Will Flavius's grandiose plans for a new aqueduct come to fruition, or will Valerius's cunning strategy derail his ambition? Tune in next time to see the latest episode of Senate Shenanigans. The Roman Senate wasn't just a place where laws were made. It was a stage for a never-ending theatrical production. The actors were senators, each vying for attention and power through verbal jousting, political maneuvering, and subtle manipulations. Their costumes, the magnificent togas, added to the dramatic flair. It was a daily showcase of eloquence and wit, but more often than not, it resembled a battleground where reputations were made and broken. It's also quite possible to compare the Senate to a high-stakes board game, with each senator a player meticulously planning their moves, forming alliances, and breaking them with equal ease. The Senate was a microcosm of Roman society itself, a complex tapestry woven with threads of ambition, betrayal, and unexpected twists. Senators were often more concerned with personal gain and social standing than with the well-being of the empire. It was a fiercely competitive environment, with senators constantly vying for the attention of the emperor and the favor of the populace. They were masters of political rhetoric and manipulation, able to spin narratives, to flatter and insult in equal measure. Furthermore, the Senate's dynamics were shaped by a complex web of personal relationships. Family ties, political alliances, and personal rivalries all influenced the political landscape. Senators formed informal groups and factions, creating shifting alliances that often resembled modern political parties. There were deep-rooted feuds that lasted for generations, often fueled by family rivalries and long-forgotten slights. The politics were personal, intense, and often brutal. The Senate's procedures were meticulously organized, but the reality was often far from orderly. Debates could become heated and prolonged, and the senators weren't shy about using personal insults and accusations against their opponents. Think of it as an extremely eloquent and heavily toga-ed version of a Twitter feud. Beyond the debates and the votes, a significant part of Senate life involved lobbying and informal negotiations. Senators frequently met privately to discuss legislation, forge alliances, and trade favors. This backroom dealing was often as important as the formal proceedings of the Senate itself. It was a world of clandestine meetings, whispered promises, and backroom bargains. To use a modern analogy, it wasn't just about what happened in the chamber. It was what happened in the cloakrooms and private dinners that really mattered. The senators' lives were dictated by a complicated interplay of social and political expectations. They were expected to maintain a certain level of decorum, but they were also under immense pressure to advance their own interests and the interests of their families. This constant tension fueled the drama and intrigue that defined the Senate. The Senate was a stage where ambition was constantly tested and reevaluated. Success required a careful blend of political acumen, oratorical skill, and sheer ruthlessness. This constant struggle for power often led to dramatic confrontations and bitter rivalries, creating a narrative that would make even the most seasoned reality TV producer envious. It was the perfect mix of ambition, power, and high-stakes political drama. It was the Roman Senate in all its chaotic glory, a spectacle that continues to captivate and amuse generations of historians and readers alike. The dust settled on the Senate's tumultuous debate, and the fate of Flavius's aqueduct, a project as grandiose as it was potentially corrupt, was sealed. But the real drama, it turned out, was only just beginning. For while the political maneuvering in the Senate chamber was a spectacle of its own, the actual construction of the aqueduct promised a whole new level of comedic chaos. Imagine, if you will, a scene straight out of a slapstick comedy. Hundreds of laborers, sweating under the Roman sun, attempting to wrestle massive blocks of stone into place. These weren't your delicate, precisely cut stones. These were behemoths, each seemingly possessing a mind of its own, stubbornly refusing to cooperate with gravity or the foreman's increasingly desperate instructions. One moment, a perfectly positioned stone would sit serenely. The next, it would decide to take an impromptu tumble, sending a ripple of panic and a cloud of dust through the ranks of the workers. The air filled with the sounds of grunts, curses, mostly in Latin naturally, and the rhythmic clang of hammers echoing off the surrounding hills. The chief engineer, a man named Marcus, whose mathematical prowess was only rivaled by his talent for inventing increasingly elaborate systems to avoid actually doing any work, surveyed the scene with a furrowed brow and a sigh that could rival the groan of a tectonic plate shifting. His initial plans, meticulously drawn on scrolls and presented to the Senate with the flourish of a seasoned gladiator entering the arena, were now scattered, literally and figuratively, across the dusty landscape. The terrain, it turned out, was far less cooperative than his elegant calculations had predicted. The initial problem wasn't just the stubbornness of the stones, it was the sheer audacity of the Roman landscape. The aqueduct, in its ambitious sweep across the countryside, decided to take on a personality of its own. It decided to flirt with precariously balanced hillsides, to test the structural integrity of every valley it crossed. Imagine the Roman equivalent of a drunken tightrope walker, except instead of a tightrope, it was a gravity-defying conduit of water, and instead of a person, it was a team of engineers attempting to stay ahead of Mother Nature's slapstick routines. One particularly memorable incident involved a rogue flock of geese. These weren't your average docile geese. These were highly territorial Roman geese, with a penchant for mischief and an uncanny ability to sense impending doom, or perhaps just an exquisite appreciation for the chaos they could create. As a crucial section of the aqueduct was nearing completion, These feathered fiends decided it was the perfect time for an impromptu aerial assault. They pecked at the freshly laid mortar, creating a series of strategically placed weaknesses that resulted in a section of the aqueduct collapsing in a dramatic, albeit hilarious, spectacle of water, stone, and honking birds. Then there was the matter of the water itself. The engineers, in their infinite wisdom, had apparently underestimated the sheer power of a moving body of water. The initial test run was a triumph of engineering, until the water decided to take a shortcut. It found a previously unnoticed fissure in the rock, creating a geyser of unexpected proportions that soaked several hundred workers, along with an unfortunate donkey that had wandered too close. The resulting scene resembled a poorly executed water balloon fight on an epic scale. And let's not forget the logistical nightmares. The transportation of materials was a Herculean task in itself. Ox-drawn carts, loaded to the breaking point with stone blocks, frequently got stuck in the mud, creating traffic jams that would make rush hour in modern Rome seem like a leisurely stroll in the park. And let's not even mention the supply chain issues related to mortar. Apparently, the Roman equivalent of Home Depot was less than efficient in their delivery services. Delays and miscommunications were frequent. The engineers found themselves constantly battling against bureaucratic red tape, material shortages, and the ever-present threat of a sudden downpour turning the construction site into a vast, muddy swamp. The construction of the aqueduct was, in many ways, a microcosm of Roman society itself. It was a blend of ambitious engineering, incredible skill, breathtaking architecture, and utter glorious chaos. The finished product was a testament to the Romans' ingenuity, a testament to the power and beauty of their engineering. But the journey to that accomplishment? That journey was a series of slapstick mishaps, near disasters, and enough comedic moments to fill 1,000 sitcoms. The aqueduct eventually was completed. The water flowed clear and pure to the delight of the citizens in the lower districts. Flavius, despite his earlier political setbacks, basked in the glory of his mostly successful project. Although Valerius, ever vigilant, managed to sneak in a clause ensuring that Flavius's share of the profits was significantly less than initially agreed. The city celebrated its triumph of engineering, but the story of the aqueduct wasn't just about the magnificence of the structure, it was also about the human element, the sheer tenacity of the workers, the ingenuity of the engineers, and the sheer, unadulterated comedic brilliance of it all. It was a testament to Roman ambition, a symphony of hard work and occasionally ludicrous failures, a story that showed that even the greatest empires weren't immune to the occasional, gloriously chaotic mishap. The aqueduct stood as a symbol of Roman achievement, but the story of its creation remained an endlessly entertaining testament to the absurd realities of life within the empire, even when those realities involved moving mountains, or at least a substantial amount of Roman rock. The Roman roads, too, deserve a mention, not merely for their engineering prowess, but also for the delightful inconveniences they presented. Straight, wide, and seemingly indestructible, they stretched across the empire, facilitating trade and military movement. However, these marvels of engineering also presented unique challenges. Imagine trying to drive a chariot through a bustling Roman street. The traffic congestion would make modern-day rush hour look like a tranquil Sunday drive. Pedestrians, animals, and merchants would all battle for space, creating a cacophony of sounds and near misses that would certainly make even the most seasoned driver sweat. The roads themselves weren't always smooth sailing either. While the Romans were masters of road building, the maintenance wasn't always up to par. Potholes were common, presenting a hazard for both chariots and pedestrians alike. The sheer amount of traffic would likely have led to an incredible number of accidents and fender benders, though details remain scarce in the historical records. The public baths, another marvel of Roman engineering, were a source of both relaxation and potential disaster. These impressive structures were marvels of heating and plumbing, capable of providing hot water to large numbers of people simultaneously. However, the realities of Roman hygiene practices combined with the limitations of ancient plumbing meant that the baths could be, let's say, less than sanitary. We have historical evidence that these were social hubs, and it's amusing to imagine the conversations, the social intrigues, and the potential for accidental encounters that would have played out in this environment. And then there were the public toilets. Let's just say they weren't exactly built with privacy in mind. The absence of private facilities in many areas meant that public restrooms were places of high traffic and low to no privacy, resulting in interesting social dynamics. The Romans, it seems, were remarkably adaptable when it came to public conveniences. Roman engineering was a complex mix of innovation, practicality, and occasional absurdity. Their structures were monumental achievements, but their construction and use were often accompanied by chaos, mishaps, and moments of pure comedic genius. From the misadventures of the aqueduct builders to the chaotic streets and the dubious hygiene of public baths, the Romans displayed a remarkable ability to find humor even in the face of monumental and sometimes literally messy undertakings. Their world was a blend of grandeur and absurdity, and it's precisely this duality that makes their story so endlessly captivating. The dust had barely settled on the freshly completed and slightly leaky aqueduct when the next chapter in Rome's grand, chaotic saga unfolded: the Roman army. Forget the Hollywood epics showcasing gleaming legions marching in perfect formation. The reality, as with most things Roman, was considerably more messy. Think less Gladiator and more Monty Python's Life of Brian, but with significantly more bloodshed. The Roman army, at its peak, was a marvel of organization and efficiency, a finely tuned machine capable of conquering vast swaths of territory. Its structure was rigidly hierarchical, a pyramid scheme of authority where the lowly legionary at the bottom toiled under the watchful gaze of centurions, tribunes, and ultimately, the emperor himself. Discipline was paramount, enforced with a brutality that would make even a modern drill sergeant blush. Desertion, insubordination, or even a slightly crooked stance during parade could result in punishments ranging from floggings to summary execution, which, let's be honest, is far more effective than extra push-ups. But beneath the veneer of military precision lay a world of hardship and surprisingly bad food. Imagine a life spent marching under the scorching sun, hauling heavy equipment across rugged terrain, sleeping in damp tents, and facing the ever-present threat of disease, injury, and enemy attack. Now add to that the culinary delights of the Roman military diet. Forget gourmet meals fit for a Caesar. The average legionary subsisted on a monotonous fare of barley porridge, stale bread, and occasionally some surprisingly tough meat, the exact origins of which were often best left uninvestigated. Think of it as the Roman equivalent of MREs, meals ready to eat. Except instead of freeze-dried chicken, you got something suspiciously resembling boiled leather. And instead of a tasty dessert, you had a handful of gritty, suspiciously unwashed olives. A Roman soldier's stomach was, by all accounts, a battlefield in itself, constantly besieged by bland gruel and potentially dubious meat products. Food poisoning was, let's say, a common occupational hazard. Imagine the digestive drama unfolding in the legionary camps. A chorus of stomach rumbles punctuated by the occasional dramatic expulsion of poorly digested barley. It certainly wasn't a glamorous aspect of military life, but it's a crucial detail in understanding the realities of service in the Roman army. The training was rigorous, designed to forge soldiers into disciplined killing machines. Young recruits, barely out of their teens, were subjected to months, even years, of grueling physical and tactical training. Swordsmanship, spear-throwing, marching, and formation drills were practiced until they became second nature. These were not mere exercises, they were life-or-death skills. One can imagine the daily routine, the relentless repetition of drills, the constant threat of punishment for even the slightest error. This, of course, does not account for the psychological toll of warfare, the trauma of witnessing brutal combat, and the moral dilemmas inherent in conquest. The legionaries weren't just soldiers, they were also administrators, builders, and sometimes even unwitting diplomats. The Roman military was also surprisingly mobile. Their mastery of logistics and engineering allowed them to move entire armies across vast distances with remarkable speed and efficiency. The intricate network of Roman roads, while prone to potholes as we've previously discussed, was essential to the army's mobility. They could swiftly deploy troops to quell rebellions, conquer new territories, or defend against incursions. However, this mobility also came with its challenges. Imagine hundreds of men, their equipment, and their rather questionable rations all crammed onto a bumpy road. Not exactly a relaxing sightseeing tour. The supply lines were often stretched thin, leading to food shortages and logistical nightmares. These logistical complications could often lead to a series of hilarious mishaps. Imagine a whole legion's supply of wine mysteriously vanishing, replaced only with a rather large quantity of bad olives. In the midst of these logistical challenges, the Roman soldiers possessed a remarkable sense of camaraderie and discipline. Their bonds were forged in the fires of shared hardship and shared triumphs. They were a brotherhood, united by their shared experiences, and despite the harsh conditions, it must have generated a certain level of bonding. This brotherhood, however, didn't always extend to the conquered populations. While the Roman army was a force for stability and order, its presence was often accompanied by violence, exploitation, and cultural upheaval. The army's role in the expansion of the empire is a complex story with both positive and negative consequences. The Romans undoubtedly brought with them superior infrastructure and technological advances, but at a steep human cost. Comparing the Roman army to modern militaries reveals some interesting contrasts. Modern armies also rely on technology, training, and discipline, but the tools and the scale of warfare are vastly different. Modern soldiers also have significantly improved rations and medical care, offering a stark contrast to the harsh reality faced by Roman legionaries. The modern military is characterized by technology, precision strikes, and complex logistical operations, a different beast compared to the Romans who relied on sheer manpower, courage, and often sheer luck. The sheer human cost of warfare remains a constant, even if the methods have changed dramatically. The life of a Roman legionary was far from glamorous. It was a life of hardship, danger, and surprisingly unappetizing food. Yet these soldiers played a vital role in shaping the Roman Empire, and their contributions to history deserve acknowledgement. Their stories, filled with both brutality and unexpected humor, offer a glimpse into a world both fascinating and profoundly different from our own. The Roman army was not just a military force, it was a microcosm of Roman society itself, a mix of discipline, ambition, and the sheer, unadulterated chaos that made the Roman Empire such a spectacular and occasionally hilarious spectacle. The Roman soldier's life is a testament to the resilience, the humor, and the sheer dogged determination of these remarkable men. And yes, probably a testament to their incredible tolerance for terrible food. We can only hope their modern counterparts have a better experience in the mess halls. Now, having survived the culinary catastrophes of the Roman army, let's turn our attention to a subject that was equally messy, though thankfully less likely to induce projectile vomiting: the Roman legal system. Forget your sleek modern courtrooms with their hushed tones and gavel-banging judges. Roman justice was a far more theatrical affair, a blend of legal procedure, political maneuvering, and enough drama to fill a dozen Netflix seasons. The Roman legal system, at least in theory, was quite sophisticated. Centuries of laws, decrees, and judicial pronouncements formed a complex body of jurisprudence that influenced legal systems for millennia. It was a system built on the principle of codified law, meaning that laws were written down and, theoretically, applied consistently. However, theoretically is the operative word here. The reality of Roman justice was often as chaotic as a Roman street during rush hour, filled with noise, confusion, and a fair bit of blatant disregard for the rules. One key element of the Roman legal system was the concept of advocates, essentially lawyers. These weren't the sharply dressed, impeccably mannered lawyers of today. Think more along the lines of flamboyant orators, skilled in rhetoric and argumentation, who were more likely to win a case with their charm and persuasive skills than with airtight legal arguments. They were, in essence, the ancient Roman equivalent of those television lawyers who are more interested in being on TV than actually helping their clients. The Roman court system was also a bit of a mixed bag. There were various courts, ranging from local tribunals handling minor disputes to more prestigious courts in Rome, dealing with matters of significant importance. The courts themselves weren't exactly the picture of serene justice. Imagine a bustling, noisy space filled with lawyers shouting, witnesses arguing, and the occasional spectator trying to sneak in some grapes from the market. Order was maintained not by hushed reverence, but by the sheer intimidation factor of the presiding judge, and a handful of rather imposing guards who were not averse to a bit of impromptu physical persuasion. And then there were the punishments. Roman justice could be swift and brutal. Depending on the crime, punishments ranged from fines and banishment to floggings, imprisonment, and in extreme cases, crucifixion. Crucifixion, as we all know, wasn't a pleasant experience. Imagine being nailed to a cross, exposed to the elements, and left to slowly die. A truly dreadful end, especially given the lack of decent Roman health insurance. Many executions were public spectacles, designed to instill fear and deter further crime. The effectiveness of this method is, of course, debatable. To truly appreciate the comedic chaos of Roman justice, let's examine a hypothetical case: the trial of Flavius the fishmonger. Flavius, a man known for his questionable fish, allegedly sourced from the Tiber River, a body of water more famous for its sewage than its seafood, was accused of selling substandard seafood. His neighbor, a disgruntled vegetarian named Lucretia, claimed that Flavius's fish caused her beloved pet tortoise, Sheldon, to suffer from severe digestive distress, leading to a week-long bout of sluggishness and a significant decline in his appetite for lettuce. The case, of course, hinged on the precise condition of the fish in question, a highly debatable point, especially given the advanced state of decomposition said to be present. Flavius's advocate, a boisterous fellow named Publius, argued that the fish was perfectly acceptable, given that a bit of Roman character only enhanced its flavor. He further suggested that Sheldon's digestive issues were likely related to his consumption of suspiciously moldy lettuce. Lucretia's advocate, a rather dry and pedantic fellow named Quintus, countered with meticulous documentation of Sheldon's previously impeccable digestive health, and presented evidence of numerous complaints against Flavius for the sale of dubious seafood. The judge, a portly man with a penchant for extravagant togas and a rather unfortunate mustache, struggled to maintain order. Witnesses were called, a surprisingly diverse cast of characters ranging from nervous street urchins to a flamboyant fish market matron. Their testimonies were often contradictory, and the courtroom proceedings involved far more yelling than the actual application of the law. There were allegations of bribery, whispered insults, and even a brief tussle involving a stolen jar of olives. The climax of the trial involved the actual examination of the aforementioned fish, or rather, what remained of it. The judge, attempting to sniff the questionable artifact, nearly passed out, resulting in a brief recess to administer some surprisingly potent smelling salts. Eventually, the judge, clearly overwhelmed by the case, delivered his verdict. Flavius was found guilty, not of selling substandard fish. The evidence was deemed too ripe for conclusive judgment, but of disturbing the peace. His punishment? A public apology featuring a detailed description of Sheldon's dietary habits, and a mandatory donation of 20 jars of the highest quality olives to the temple of Fortuna, the goddess of luck. Apparently, everyone in Rome needed a bit more luck. Flavius's trial, while fictional, highlights both the strengths and the glaring weaknesses of the Roman legal system. While the Romans had a system of codified laws and established procedures, the reality of their courts was often influenced by personal biases, political pressures, and a generous helping of outright chaos. It was a system that could be both impressively sophisticated and hilariously absurd, a perfect reflection of the Roman Empire itself, a civilization capable of stunning architectural marvels and utterly baffling legal decisions all in the same day. And that, my friends, is why ancient Roman history remains so endlessly entertaining. The laws might be ancient, but the absurdity is timeless. The next time you face a traffic ticket or a legal dispute, remember Flavius the fishmonger and count yourself lucky that your justice isn't quite so Roman. Chapter 3. Death, Afterlife, and a Few Last Laughs. Now, if navigating the Roman legal system sounds like a headache, wait until you hear about Roman funerals. These weren't your quiet, somber affairs. Oh no, these were productions, grand spectacles that could rival any modern-day Hollywood blockbuster, depending on the deceased's bank account, of course. Death in ancient Rome wasn't just a biological event, it was a major social occasion, a chance to flaunt your wealth, if you had any, pay homage to the departed, and generally make a big, boisterous fuss. For the average Roman, death was a far more subdued affair. Forget elaborate processions and marble mausoleums. Cremation was the common practice, often a relatively simple cremation ceremony performed in a designated area outside the city walls. The ashes were then collected and placed in a simple urn, sometimes kept within the family home, sometimes deposited in a family tomb or columbarium, a fancy term for a multi-storied pigeonhole apartment building for urns. These ceremonies, while lacking the extravagant flair of the rich, were still steeped in religious significance, with prayers, offerings, and symbolic gestures intended to ensure a smooth passage to the afterlife. Think of it as the Roman equivalent of a small, intimate funeral, maybe a backyard gathering with some close friends and family, a few heartfelt speeches, and an appropriate amount of wine. But for the wealthy elite, buckle up because things got considerably more theatrical. Think elaborate processions, dramatic mourners, extravagant feasts, and enough incense to knock out a small army. Imagine a funeral procession snaking through the city streets, a river of mourners, their faces smeared with grief, or maybe just soot from the cremation pyre, accompanied by a brass band playing mournful tunes, if they could afford one. The deceased, laid out in state, might be adorned in their finest finery, perhaps even wearing a mask that bore a striking resemblance to their former self, a creepy yet surprisingly common practice. The funeral procession itself was a statement of social standing. The longer and more elaborate the procession, the wealthier and more influential the deceased. Carriages carrying family and friends would be followed by mourners on foot, possibly even professional mourners hired to add to the spectacle of grief. The route would often pass by prominent public spaces, ensuring maximum visibility and an opportunity to display the deceased's, and by extension the family's, importance to the community. It was basically a walking, talking, incense-filled advertisement for their social standing. The whole thing was less about mourning and more about a very public display of wealth and social prestige, a last grand gesture to remind everyone of the deceased's impact and the family's continued prominence. And once the procession reached its destination, the real show began. If cremation was chosen, which was common even for the wealthy, the body would be laid upon a pyre, often constructed of expensive woods and lavishly decorated with flowers and other offerings. While the body burned, elaborate speeches were given by family members, close friends, or even hired orators, a veritable roast of the deceased with anecdotes both funny and poignant, often recounted with much dramatic flair. Imagine stand-up comedy, but with considerably more incense. The speeches were not always reverent. They sometimes included witty anecdotes and even embarrassing revelations about the deceased's life, a testament to the Romans' rather blunt approach to death and its accompanying rituals. After the cremation, the ashes were carefully collected and placed in an urn, which might be deposited in a family tomb, a lavish mausoleum, or even a specially constructed columbarium. These tombs, especially those of the wealthy, could be incredibly ornate, adorned with sculptures, frescoes, and inscriptions detailing the deceased's life and accomplishments, a kind of permanent monumental selfie. These were not simply places for storing ashes. They were elaborate monuments designed to preserve the memory of the deceased and display the family's wealth and power. Let's imagine the funeral of a wealthy Roman patrician, say Marcus Valerius Flaccus, a man known for his questionable business dealings, his extravagant lifestyle, and his remarkable collection of pet parrots. His funeral would have been a truly spectacular event. The procession, starting from his palatial villa on the outskirts of Rome, would have stretched for blocks. Mourners, many hired for the occasion and decked out in somber purple, would trail behind elaborately decorated carriages, their chants amplified by hired musicians playing mournful flutes and lyres. Flaccus, lying in state in a gilded carriage, would be adorned in his finest toga and wearing a death mask crafted from the finest ivory, meticulously painted to resemble him in his prime. The cremation itself would have been a magnificent pyre, built not of simple wood, but of fragrant cedar and olive wood, piled high with exotic spices and flowers. The flames would have crackled and danced under the watchful gaze of a throng of onlookers, while hired mourners wailed dramatically, showcasing their impressive lung capacity and theatrical flair. The speeches, delivered by Flaccus's son and a couple of hired orators, would have been a mix of genuine grief, carefully chosen flattery, and rather scandalous anecdotes about his questionable financial dealings and his penchant for betting on chariot races. The orators might have also recounted amusing stories of Flaccus's pet parrots, their eccentric behaviors, and their unfortunate habit of stealing shiny objects. Following the cremation, the ashes would have been carefully collected and placed into a stunning urn made of polished marble, intricately carved with images of Flaccus's life and accomplishments, conveniently overlooking his less savory habits. The urn would then have been placed in a family mausoleum, a magnificent structure adorned with marble columns, statues, and frescoes depicting scenes of Flaccus's triumphant chariot races and his impressively large and noisy flock of parrots. The mausoleum would have been designed to withstand the ravages of time, a permanent testament to his importance and, of course, his family's wealth. The final feast, a lavish banquet held for friends and family, would have included enough food and wine to feed a small army, and enough parrots to cause a ruckus. It would have been a celebration of his life, albeit with a healthy dose of Roman theatricality. Contrast this with the funeral of a commoner, perhaps a humble baker named Aulus. Aulus's death would have been a far less extravagant affair. His body might have been cremated in a designated area outside the city, his ashes placed in a simple urn made of clay. The funeral procession, if one existed at all, would have been modest, consisting of close family and friends. There might have been simple prayers and offerings, and perhaps a small feast of bread and wine shared in remembrance. The differing styles of funerals reflect the vast social inequalities of Roman society. Death, even in death, highlighted the disparities between rich and poor. The lavish funerals of the wealthy were a testament to their power and influence, while the simpler ceremonies of the common people reflected their more modest circumstances. Yet, even in their simplicity, these funerals were imbued with religious significance, providing comfort and hope to those left behind. The focus may have differed, but the underlying purpose, the respectful passage of the deceased to the next world, remained the same, despite the varying degrees of spectacle. The Romans, even in death, were nothing if not dramatic. And that, my friends, is why studying their funerals, and indeed all aspects of their lives, is a strangely entertaining experience. After all, who needs Netflix when you've got Roman history? Now, let's talk about the Roman belief system, a delightful concoction of gods, ghosts, and what we might politely call enthusiastic interpretations of the supernatural. Forget neatly organized theological systems. Roman religion was more like a bustling marketplace of deities, each with their own quirks, rivalries, and surprisingly relatable flaws. Jupiter, the king of the gods, was basically the Roman equivalent of a grumpy old CEO, constantly battling with his wife Juno. Think corporate espionage and marital disputes on an Olympian scale. Mars, the god of war, was the ultimate party animal, always ready for a good brawl. And let's be honest, he was probably the reason for the gladiator games, a truly Roman way of celebrating military prowess. Venus, the goddess of love, was, well, let's just say she was busy. And then there were the lesser deities, household gods, gods of agriculture, gods of doors, seriously, gods of everything you can possibly imagine. The Roman pantheon was a celestial bureaucracy to rival any modern-day government. Imagine trying to navigate this chaotic world of gods. A Roman's daily life was interwoven with religious practices, from morning prayers to offerings and sacrifices. Before embarking on any significant endeavor, a Roman would often consult the auspices. Basically, they'd check in with the gods to see if they approved. This typically involved observing the flight of birds, examining the entrails of sacrificed animals, or listening for divine pronouncements whispered on the wind, or maybe just really strong gusts. A bad omen? Well, that could spell trouble for everything from a business deal to a planned military campaign. It was a bit like checking your horoscope every morning, but with far higher stakes. Divination was a big deal. There were professional diviners who were adept at interpreting various signs and omens, ranging from the aforementioned bird flight patterns and animal entrails to the patterns of spilled wine. Who knew wine spilling could be so profound? These individuals were basically the ancient Roman equivalent of psychic mediums, often consulted by politicians, generals, and even regular citizens seeking guidance on important matters. It's likely many made up some of these divinations to fill their pockets. Now, beyond the official pantheon, Roman beliefs extended into the realm of the supernatural. Ghosts were considered to be quite common, with stories of restless spirits haunting homes and graveyards. Think of it as an ancient version of a haunted house, but with togas. These weren't always malevolent. Sometimes they were simply lingering spirits needing a little help moving on, usually with a prayer or offering. In other instances, they were distinctly unhappy about something and would let you know it through spooky noises, inexplicable occurrences, and the occasional bout of ghostly poltergeist activity. Interestingly, some aspects of Roman religion bore a striking resemblance to what we might call voodoo in modern terms. Certain rituals involved using charms, spells, and even curses to influence events or harm enemies. Imagine writing an angry letter to your nemesis, but instead of posting it, you bury it in a graveyard complete with a few choice herbs and incantations. This wasn't just limited to petty grievances. Influential Romans sometimes used these practices to manipulate politics and climb the social ladder. Let's call it ancient Roman Machiavellianism, with a side of herbal remedies. The Romans were also big believers in magic and sorcery. Amulets, talismans, and various magical charms were worn to ward off evil spirits or bring good luck. These magical items often contained inscriptions or images meant to invoke the power of specific deities or supernatural forces. These would be anything from a small statue of a protective deity to an intricately designed amulet engraved with protective symbols and placed into a piece of jewelry to ensure the wearer was protected from any sort of negativity. This may seem strange to us, but consider how many people today still wear lucky charms or carry good luck pennies in their pockets. And let's not forget the role of dreams. Romans frequently sought divine guidance through dream interpretation. Oniromancy, the art of interpreting dreams, was considered a valuable tool for gaining insight into the future or understanding the divine will. Dreams weren't just a random jumble of images. They were believed to be messages from the gods or the spirits of the dead, offering warnings or providing valuable information. Therefore, it's no wonder they had so many dream diaries to keep a note of all of this. Interestingly, the Romans' religious beliefs weren't always neatly compartmentalized. They were surprisingly open to incorporating elements from other cultures. Their pantheon included deities from other pantheons, and religious practices borrowed from other societies often seamlessly integrated into their already complex religious landscape. So, for example, while officially worshiping Jupiter, a Roman might also consult Egyptian oracles or seek guidance from Celtic druids. This eclecticism points to a society not afraid of exploring different perspectives and finding religious comfort wherever they could. Think of it as a religious smorgasbord. Now, the effectiveness of Roman magic and divination is, of course, debatable. However, what's undeniable is the profound impact these beliefs had on daily life. The Romans' deep-seated religious beliefs shaped their behaviors, their social interactions, and their understanding of the world around them. Religion wasn't a separate sphere. It was woven into the very fabric of their existence. Even the most mundane activities were infused with religious significance. Before eating a meal, Romans would offer a portion to the gods. Before embarking on a journey, they would offer prayers for safe travels. And if anything went wrong, it was often attributed to the displeasure of the gods, requiring appeasement through offerings, sacrifices, or even elaborate public rituals. It's crucial to understand that the world view of a Roman was shaped by their religious beliefs. The line between the natural and supernatural was blurred. Fate and fortune were viewed as intertwined with the whims of the gods. This is something we can only truly grasp from looking at the religious elements within the culture and lifestyle of the Romans. So, The next time you're tempted to dismiss ancient Roman religion as a bunch of superstitious mumbo-jumbo, remember the complexity and depth of their belief system. It was a fascinating blend of official religion, folk beliefs, and practices borrowed from other cultures, all seamlessly interwoven into the daily lives of both emperors and commoners. And while the methods of communicating with their gods may seem a bit eccentric to modern sensibilities, the underlying human desire for meaning, guidance, and a little bit of supernatural reassurance is one we can still relate to. It's really the same as all other cultures that came before, and all those who will come after. The same basic fears, the same basic hopes, and the same basic, almost irrational desire for answers. They just had a slightly more theatrical approach. Let's leave the swirling mists of Roman religious beliefs and step into something a little less ethereal, something a bit more visceral, something involving leeches. We're talking, of course, about Roman medicine. Now, before you conjure images of toga-clad physicians wielding rusty scalpels in dimly lit apothecaries, let's set the record straight. Roman medicine wasn't entirely barbaric, though it certainly had its interesting moments. Imagine, if you will, a bustling Roman marketplace. The air hangs thick with the smells of roasting meats, exotic spices, and something vaguely reminiscent of a week-old fish. Amidst the chaos, we find our fictional friend, Dr. Aulus Cornelius, a physician with a surprisingly modern approach, for the time at least, which by modern standards still isn't all that impressive. He's attending to a patient, a plump senator named Flavius, who's complaining of a persistent headache. Flavius, a man accustomed to the finer things in life, including ample quantities of wine, gestures dramatically to his throbbing temple. "Doctor," he groans, "this pain. It's as if Jupiter himself is using my skull as a personal anvil. Doctor." Aulus, ever the professional, or at least trying to be, examines Flavius with a critical eye. He checks his pulse, a surprisingly accurate method even by today's standards, and notes the senator's flushed complexion. "Senator," he declares with a theatrical flourish, "I suspect an imbalance of humors." Now, for those unfamiliar with the ancient Roman understanding of the human body, the humors were thought to be four vital fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An imbalance of these humors was believed to be the root cause of most ailments. Think of it as ancient Roman energy healing, but with significantly less chakra talk. "An imbalance of humors, you say?" Flavius sputters, clearly not impressed with this diagnosis. He'd expected something more along the lines of a vengeful spirit, or maybe a curse from a disgruntled rival. Doctor Aulus, undeterred, continues, "Indeed, Senator, the excessive consumption of wine, always a problematic factor, has clearly aggravated your yellow bile. And so begins the treatment. This isn't some delicate process. First, bloodletting. Oh yes, this was a popular Roman remedy for practically everything from headaches to heartbreak. Doctor Aulus, with a practiced hand and a reassuringly sharp lancet, opens a vein in Flavius's arm, letting the blood flow freely into a bowl. Flavius winces, but the grim satisfaction on Dr. Aulus's face suggests this is a common occurrence. Next, a herbal concoction. Now, Roman herbal remedies were a mixed bag. Some were surprisingly effective. Willow bark, for instance, contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, while others were, well, let's just say they wouldn't pass FDA approval. Dr. Aulus prescribes a potion of crushed poppy seeds. For pain relief, we'll give him that. Henbane, a powerful hallucinogen, and something vaguely described as dried lizard dung. We'll politely skip the specifics. The facial expression of Flavius tells the tale. Finally, leeches. Yes, leeches. These slimy little creatures were considered to be highly effective in removing bad blood. Doctor Aulus carefully attaches several plump leeches to Flavius's temple, allowing them to suck away the offending yellow bile. Flavius lets out a rather undignified squeal, a sound completely unlike the dignified senator he projects in the Senate. Now, before we write off Roman medicine as a chaotic mix of trial and error, let's acknowledge their impressive knowledge in some areas. Roman surgeons were surprisingly skilled, capable of performing complex procedures, including amputations and setting bones. They understood the importance of cleanliness, to an extent. And some Roman physicians even practiced dissection, a revolutionary practice at the time. However, the juxtaposition between these advancements and their questionable cures is simply hilarious. The use of bizarre ingredients and the emphasis on bloodletting highlight the stark contrast between their limited understanding of human physiology and their attempts to alleviate pain and illness. Consider the treatment for a broken bone. Setting the bone was one thing, but the post-operative care sometimes involved applying poultices made of crushed herbs, animal fats, and, you guessed it, more leeches. Imagine trying to explain this to your surgeon today. And then there's the concept of sympathetic magic, where cures like, for example, if someone suffered from a toothache, they might try chewing on a root that resembled a tooth. Or if someone was suffering from some sort of blood-related illness, they might try drinking blood from another animal. The logic is certainly unique. One of the funniest examples is the use of mummy medicine. Yes, you read that right. Ground-up mummies were considered a powerful remedy for various ailments, and were often blended into potions and balms. One can only imagine the somewhat pungent smell of these remedies. A few entrepreneurial types even started an early mummy mining operation to meet the growing demand. That sounds oddly like early modern-day pharmaceutical marketing. Let's not forget the role of the barber surgeon, a fascinating individual who provided both haircuts and surgical services. It's unclear whether this was efficient or just terrifying, and the level of hygiene is very debatable, considering the barber surgeons often worked in the middle of a marketplace, among all the smells and general filth. The Romans, being as pragmatic as they were, also developed advanced surgical instruments. Think delicate forceps, scalpels, and even rudimentary retractors. They were capable of performing remarkably complex procedures, including amputations and tracheotomies. But even the most skilled surgeons were often operating blind, lacking the knowledge of anatomy we have today. This sometimes led to unexpected complications. Despite their advancements, many Roman medical practices were rooted in superstition and mythology. A combination of ancient Greek medical knowledge, folk remedies, and the ever-present influence of religion resulted in a curious mix of sophisticated techniques and utterly bizarre treatments. What's truly remarkable about Roman medicine, however, isn't just the strangeness of their remedies, but the sheer persistence with which they clung to certain practices. Bloodletting, despite its obvious drawbacks, remained a staple for centuries. Why? Because it seemed to work sometimes, and the placebo effect is, as we now know, a powerful force indeed. So the next time you feel a headache coming on, remember Flavius and Dr. Aulus. Consider yourself lucky that modern medicine offers something better than a bowl of blood and a handful of leeches. While the humor lies in the ridiculousness of some Roman practices, there's also a profound respect to be had for their attempts to alleviate suffering, even when armed with limited knowledge and some truly questionable concoctions. They tried, and in the world of ancient medicine, that's something of a miracle in itself. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go check my blood pressure, just in case the ghosts of Roman physicians are upset by my commentary. And perhaps I should avoid the herbal teas for a while. You just never know. So, we've had a chuckle at Roman medicine, haven't we? A delightful blend of the surprisingly effective and the utterly bonkers. But now, my friends, we must turn our attention to a subject even more dramatic, even more prone to slapstick than a particularly enthusiastic troop of gladiators: the fall of the Roman Empire. Imagine this: the grandest empire the world has ever seen, a civilization that boasted aqueducts that could make a modern-day engineer weep with envy, roads that stretched across continents, and a legal system so complex it's still being debated by law students today. All of it crumbling like a really, really old and magnificent cake, slowly succumbing to the ravages of time, incompetent bakers, and maybe a rogue badger. This wasn't some sudden dramatic collapse like a poorly constructed coliseum collapsing during a particularly boisterous lion feeding. Oh no, this was a slow, drawn-out affair, a historical soap opera with more twists and turns than a Roman chariot race. Think of it as a comedy of errors, a multi-act extravaganza of political blunders, economic mishaps, and barbarian incursions so delightfully chaotic, you'll be rolling in the aisles. Assuming, of course, that you haven't been overrun by Visigoths. Act 1, The Emperor's Follies. Picture this: a revolving door of emperors, each more eccentric than the last. We're talking emperors who were more interested in their pet peacocks than the stability of the empire. Emperors who spent more time pondering the mysteries of the universe than dealing with the barbarian hordes at the gates. And emperors who, let's just say, had some rather questionable hygiene habits. Caligula, of course, needs no introduction. The man who declared war on the sea. The sea! What kind of military strategist is out there declaring war on an ocean, I ask you? Even the most battle-hardened general would have trouble with that strategy. I mean, how do you even deploy your troops? Are there amphibious legions? Then there's Nero, the artiste who fiddled while Rome... Well, it's a classic, though it might be a tad embellished for theatrical effect. It is more likely he was just out enjoying himself as the fire raged on. The man had his priorities, apparently, and they weren't exactly saving Rome. He even had a pet parrot that could apparently speak. I've heard it was a very talented parrot. I've even heard that the parrot gave some pretty accurate predictions of the fall of the empire. It certainly would have been a funnier way for history to play out. A talking parrot that predicts the downfall of an empire? That's got the making of a comedy right there. And let's not forget Commodus, the emperor who preferred gladiatorial combat to governing. The guy had the physique of a gladiator, and that's great, but the man's love for fighting in the arena was a little too enthusiastic. Imagine having to run an empire while also making sure you win those gladiatorial contests. The man must have had a terrible sleep schedule. The constant succession of emperors, each with their own eccentricities, their own agendas, and their own levels of incompetence, created a climate of political instability that weakened the very foundations of the empire. It was like a never-ending game of musical chairs, except the chairs were provinces and the players were emperors constantly vying for power. No wonder everything started falling apart. Act 2, the economy's epic fail. Rome's economy, once a mighty juggernaut, started showing signs of strain, similar to a weary chariot after a particularly long and bumpy race. Inflation soared, causing bread prices to spike, a surefire recipe for disaster in any civilization, ancient or modern. I mean, imagine what would happen if the cost of pizza suddenly went through the roof. There would be riots. There would be uprisings. There would be chaos. Well, the Romans were no different, except they were eating bread and not pizza. The constant warfare drained the empire's resources, like a leaky aqueduct slowly draining a city's water supply. Taxes soared, leading to widespread discontent among the populace, who, let's face it, were already dealing with the rather unstable political climate. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer, and the middle class, well, let's just say they weren't having much fun either. It was an economic inequality that would make even a modern-day economist raise an eyebrow. It sounds just like our economic climate today. I wonder if the Romans had any sort of equivalent to Wall Street. Did they have stock markets? I'd bet they did, and probably equally as corrupt as the ones we have today. Act 3. Barbarians at the gate and inside. The barbarian invasions, often depicted as a relentless tide of savage warriors sweeping across the landscape, were actually a more complex affair. It's not like one day, Rome woke up to find hordes of barbarians already inside their city. It was a gradual process, a slow, creeping infiltration of different barbarian tribes who gradually weakened and destabilized the already crumbling infrastructure of the empire. Some barbarian tribes were actually assimilated into Roman society, becoming Roman citizens themselves and adding their own unique cultural flavor to the mix. Others formed alliances with Roman generals, adding to the already tangled web of political intrigue. So, not just mindless hordes, but rather a diverse group of people with their own motivations, agendas, and their own levels of ambition. Maybe we should have treated them better. I mean, we could have integrated them into society and saved ourselves the trouble of a massive war. Think of the resources that could have been saved. The final act involved a series of events, where different parts of the Roman Empire fell, one by one, like dominoes in a particularly elaborate game. West Rome, unable to handle the constant pressures, finally succumbed to the combined forces of internal strife and external threats. The eastern half of the empire, however, managed to survive for another 1,000 years, becoming what is now known as the Byzantine Empire. It wasn't a pretty end, but a slow and prolonged one. More of a slow fade-out than a sudden crash. It's just like an old sitcom that's running out of ideas but keeps making new episodes. It's not good, but people still watch it. So, The fall of Rome wasn't simply a dramatic event, it was a complicated comedy of errors, a mix of political buffoonery, economic mismanagement, and barbarian incursions. It was a long, slow, drawn-out process, a bit like a really, really bad opera. It's a testament to the empire's resilience that it lasted as long as it did, considering the constant chaos and the sheer volume of incompetent rulers. And that, my friends, is why the fall of Rome is not just a tragedy, but a comedy. A hilarious and tragic comedy of epic proportions filled with more twists, turns, and questionable decisions than a Roman emperor's will. It's a story that reminds us that even the mightiest of empires can crumble, and sometimes, the most entertaining stories are those filled with spectacular failures. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need a goblet of wine, preferably not poisoned, to help me process all this. And perhaps some bread. Expensive bread, just to be safe. So, we've chuckled at the emperors, their questionable decisions, and their even more questionable hygiene. We've mourned, briefly, the economic woes and the barbarian incursions. But what does it all mean? What in the name of Jupiter can a bunch of crumbling ruins and ridiculously oversized togas teach us about life in the 21st century? Quite a lot, actually, if you're willing to look beyond the togas and the togas wearing. Firstly, let's acknowledge the sheer scale of Roman engineering prowess. Aqueducts that defied gravity and common sense, given the amount of lead piping involved. Roads that crisscrossed the empire, connecting disparate cultures and fostering trade. These weren't just impressive feats of construction. They were statements of ambition, planning, and, let's be honest, a healthy dose of we can totally do this even if it takes 100 years and thousands of slaves. The Romans weren't perfect planners. Their projects weren't immune to cost overruns or dodgy contractors. Sound familiar? Modern infrastructure projects often mirror this process, with plenty of political wrangling and budgetary concerns. Perhaps we could learn a thing or two from Roman logistical skills to ensure our own ambitious projects don't end up as half-finished, crumbling monuments to hubris. Secondly, Roman law, while often convoluted and occasionally cruel, laid the groundwork for many of the legal systems we use today. The concept of codified law, the idea of due process, at least for some, the very notion of a legal framework, these all have roots in Roman jurisprudence. We might scoff at some of the specific laws, the ones about adultery, for instance, seem a bit one-sided, but the fundamental principles of fairness, justice, and ideally equality remain relevant even today. We can still find ourselves grappling with the complexities of legal systems, arguing about interpretations and justice. The Romans were trying to solve some of the same fundamental issues in a vastly different context and setting. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, Rome's collapse provides a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency, corruption, and unchecked power. The slow decline of the empire wasn't caused by a single event, but by a confluence of factors: political instability, economic mismanagement, internal strife, and external pressures. Sound familiar? History has a habit of repeating itself, and the fall of Rome serves as a stark reminder that even the mightiest empires can crumble under their own weight if they fail to adapt, address their internal problems, and stay responsive to the needs of their people. Perhaps the biggest lesson from Rome's downfall is the importance of accountability and sensible governance. A little less self-serving political maneuvering and a little more attention to the concerns of ordinary citizens might have prevented the whole catastrophic collapse. Let's not forget the entertainment. While the gladiatorial games might make modern sensibilities shudder, they were a crucial part of Roman society, providing a release valve for social tensions and a spectacle that captivated the masses. The parallels with our own entertainment industry, with its blockbuster movies, reality TV shows, and the ever-present thirst for spectacle, are undeniable. We, too, seek distraction, thrilling events, and communal experiences. Perhaps our methods are a little more sophisticated, but the underlying need for entertainment remains. We can learn from the Romans' understanding that public entertainment can play a major part in the life of a nation. It's a useful tool, but it should be balanced with responsible governance. And what about Roman social life? The public baths, the bustling marketplaces, the gossip-filled forums. These provide a glimpse into a society that, despite its flaws, was undeniably vibrant and dynamic. Our own social lives, while vastly different in many ways, share a common thread: the need for community, connection, and of course, a good gossip session. Whether it's the shared experience of attending a sporting event, meeting up with friends at a cafe, or even engaging in an online forum, we're repeating many of the social patterns found in ancient Rome. The Romans, in a way, invented social media, only the channels are a bit more diverse today. The Roman approach to medicine was, shall we say, unconventional. The reliance on bizarre remedies, the belief in the healing power of leeches, which surprisingly sometimes worked, and the general lack of hygiene. All of these things are a cautionary tale for our modern medical world. While we've made incredible advances in medicine, it's essential to always be mindful of the potential for biases, misinterpretations, and overconfidence. The Romans' approach should teach us to maintain a degree of healthy skepticism and to ensure our treatments are scientifically sound, not just based on some bizarre remedy passed down from one generation to another. The Roman obsession with status and wealth is also something to consider. The vast chasm between the rich and poor, the constant striving for social elevation, and the display of wealth and power. All of these things resonate strongly with modern society. While the specifics may have changed, the underlying human desires for status and recognition haven't. Perhaps the most significant lesson from the Roman experience is the importance of social mobility. We need to strive for a society that offers opportunities to all, regardless of their background or birthright. If the Romans had managed to find a better balance between the wealthy and the poor, perhaps their empire would have lasted longer. Finally, the sheer absurdity of many aspects of Roman life, the emperor's antics, the questionable fashion choices, togas really, the sometimes baffling legal decisions, should remind us to keep a sense of humor about ourselves and our own society. History, even the history of a mighty empire, is full of funny, bizarre, and often tragic events. We often see events of today as unique, as never having happened before, but they usually have historical precedence. While we must learn from history's mistakes, we shouldn't forget to laugh at ourselves along the way. So what have we learned? Rome's rise and fall, seen through the lens of humor and careful observation, offers a wealth of insights into human nature, societal dynamics, and the enduring challenges of building and maintaining a successful society. It's a reminder that even the mightiest empires can crumble, that even the most brilliant minds can make terrible decisions, and that even the most chaotic periods of history can offer valuable lessons for the future. Perhaps, above all, it's a reminder to keep a sense of humor, because let's face it, life, like the Roman Empire, is often absurd and possibly riddled with poisoned wine. So drink responsibly, my friends, and learn from the mistakes of the Romans, because history, as they say, tends to repeat itself. And that's a lesson I would really prefer us to avoid.